In today's video, we're going to talk about access management for a SharePoint-based Canvas app. So I will cover how to do this with a Dataverse table, and it's actually very similar. It's not that much different, but we're going to talk about how to specifically do access management. And I'm not talking about the app being shared. I'm talking more about how do we restrict access to different resources within the app. So how do we say maybe you've got a developer or you've got an admin or you've got a view only and you've got essentially different objects inside of that app that you want to restrict access to. How do you do that? And in this video, we're going to talk about that. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first thing we need is we need to have a SharePoint list to work with. So let's go ahead and go to our site contents here, and we're going to create a SharePoint list. Let's go ahead and create new. And for this one, we'll just take a basic list and we'll call it project request access management. Kind of a mouthful there, but it's going to be for our project request, and it's going to essentially control our access for that app. So that's what this is eventually going to come into, is that actual app build. I typically don't show this in the site navigation. Again, I tend to keep people away from the SharePoint lists whenever possible. So let's go ahead and remove that and then hit create. Now for this app, we're not going to get too crazy. It's going to be a very simple application. Let's go ahead and add admin. So we'll make it a yes, no, hit next, and we'll just call it admin. Very simple. And we want the default value to be no. So whenever we add somebody in here, we don't want to make everybody an admin. Now, where would you want to make this yes? Well, maybe view only. Maybe every person that you want in here, you want to at least give view only access if you want to use that inside of your app. But let's go ahead and hit the save button here. So we've got our admin. And then let's go ahead and add another column, and this one's going to be a person column. So we want to be able to select who can have access to the application. And we'll call this a person. It could be point of contact. It could be you pick your name and whatever works for you in your situation, whatever makes sense. But in this case, it's a person column, so let's just call it a person column. And we'll go ahead and select show profile photos. It isn't required, but if I ever did want to use the SharePoint list, I typically like having that in there. You can not choose this, choose this. It actually makes zero difference in terms of the app, whether you choose this or not. So let's go ahead and select that. Now, we don't typically want to do multiple selections for access. You will do basically a row per person. I typically don't make anything required. I let the app handle requirements. So a lot of times I won't put requirements on an underlying data table. The exception being sometimes I'll do that for a Dataverse table if it makes sense to, especially if I'm doing a model-driven app. Now you can say enforce unique values so that you don't get duplicates, because you really shouldn't put the same person in there twice. So we'll go ahead and select that so we don't have essentially more than the one person entered in there. Let's go ahead and hit save. And now we've got essentially our two primary columns that we're going to worry about here is the person and the admin. Now the title column, a lot of times what I'll do with that is when I add somebody into like an access management view or something like that, I'll usually put the person's name in this field. And why do I do that? Because text is way easier to work with than a lookup. And this is essentially functions a lot like a lookup column. Way easier to work with a text field over a person field like this. The reason being is because you can delegate text functions. So essentially it becomes much easier to work with a text field over this person column later on. So keep this, don't necessarily get rid of it, but realize you don't necessarily need it unless you're trying to do filters, sorts, and a lot of different things with the data. Then this field becomes very helpful. And you might even want to rename this to person name or person email, however you plan on using this. A lot of times you make shadow columns for the metadata associated with the person when you use SharePoint. You don't necessarily need to do that as often when you use Dataverse, but when you're working with SharePoint, a lot of times you have to use shadow columns, which is you've got the person field here. Well, person includes a lot of information. primarily the email address, which is unique to each user in your system for the most part, and then the name of the individual. Well, those two fields could be separate fields, and we kind of call those shadow columns. So they're there. A lot of times the app handles the saving of all that information, so you don't have to really do anything with it. You don't have to create a Power Automate or anything like that. You could build that entire process into the app. But if you start running into delegation issues, you might want to take a look at doing shadow columns. I'm not going to cover that in this particular video, but I'm mentioning it because that will probably be a topic in the future. So check back to my channel or put a comment in there if that's something you're interested in. That way I know to focus on that in the coming videos, is how to do that particular process. All right, so that's pretty much it for this view. Very simple, very quick. Now let's go to the actual application. All right, so this is our app, and it's just a standard Canvas app. I haven't done anything to it. This is just the load screen that comes with it. I haven't changed anything. It's just brand new. Haven't even named it application. So we're going to start from scratch with figuring out how to do this. And the first thing we want to do is add our data source. So let's go ahead and add data, and then we're going to look for SharePoint and find our SharePoint connector here. And then we're going to say connect directly because it's a SharePoint online. If you're using like a SharePoint 2019 or something that's not online, then you're going to want to use your on-premise data gateway to connect to it, or maybe you're using some other data source entirely, then you might want to use this depending on what it is. But if it's cloud-based, let's just go ahead and click the connect button here. And then we'll see our different options that we've got here. And for me, it's this first one, so we'll go ahead and select this one. And then we're going to look for our list that we just created. And here it is. So let's go ahead and hit the connect button. And there we go. Now we've got our first data source added in here. Now we're going to go take a look at our app settings. And this is typically where I put the access management information, is inside the app here. You can also put it in the on visible. I actually just had a recent issue where Microsoft made an update to the environment, and all of a sudden the app stopped working with all of the app on selects. So I actually had to move things into the first page on visible in order to get the app back up and running. Very strange situation, very strange circumstance. And it eventually resolved itself over the course of the day. So that kind of stuff does happen. So it's good to know that a lot of stuff can run straight out of the on visible property of your screen, but traditionally, you're going to put it in the app right here. So we're going to select that and then go to our OnStart function here. Let's give ourselves a little bit of extra space to put this in there. And we're going to put a bunch of information in here that's going to control some of our access management. All right, so I'm going to actually show you two different ways you can do this. There's the first way, which most people typically use, and then I'm going to show you what's probably the better approach for this also. But both work, both can work very well, so it's good to be aware of both options. And in one case, you're going to use it probably quite a bit more, so I'm going to cover that also just so you can see the syntax and you can kind of see how to set everything up. But before we even talk about access management, what are some very common things you want to do right off the bat? And the very first things you want to take a look at is your user information. So we're going to go ahead and create some variables. And I typically go with GBL, global variable. Whenever you use the set function, it makes it available across the entire app. And you want to kind of name your variables based on how they're used. So I typically go with GBL. I believe Microsoft has a document that sets this is kind of what the recommended variable name is GBL. And then if it's a local variable, so it's only going to work on that particular page, you might start with LOC for local. But in this case, we're talking about a variable that's going to work across the entire app. So we're going to want to go with GBL or something, whatever works for you, just kind of be consistent. So when you're looking at your application, you know, okay, that's a global variable. That's something that only works on this page. And it'll be very easy to identify what you're looking at based off of how the prefix is set up for on that variable. Now in this case, we're going to say GBL user, and then we're going to put a comma, and we're going to say user, and then we're going to close it just like this. And all we're doing right now is getting the logged in user's information. Very simple syntax. And we'll go ahead and put a semicolon here just to kind of close it off, because we're going to put more stuff, and this is how you separate things, is put that semicolon in there. So what does this do? It essentially pulls in the record data for me as the logged in user. And with this, I can actually get a ton of other information just based off of just this alone. But we're going to have more information. So let's go ahead and hit the enter key, and then we'll do a couple other things. So we'll say GBL user name. because we want to have the name of the individual that's logged in to the Power App. And let's go ahead and go with user, and then again we'll close it off like this, and then we'll say dot email, and then we'll close it off. So now we've got the email address of the individual. And the other thing I always get whenever I set up an app is the name. So let's go ahead and say set GBL username, and then we'll set it just like this. And there we go. Now we've got 3 variables already set that are accessible across our entire app. Now, any page, anywhere we use this, we'll be able to call those variables. So let's go ahead and test this out. Let's go ahead and insert a text label. And it doesn't matter where it's going to go. And that's fine. Let's go put it there. And then let's change our text property, and let's go with GBL, and we'll go with username. Now you're saying, well, it's blank. Why is it blank? Well, we put it in the app OnStart. Well, the app was already started, so we have to actually run the app OnStart. And we do that by hitting over here, right click, and then go to run OnStart. And then all we need to do is move this above the screen, and there we go. And we can see that my name is now here, and there we go. Now if we go back to our app here, we have actually made a mistake. So let's change this. This should actually be email. I don't know what I was thinking when I typed that in there, but there we go. So now we've got email, we've got our full name. So now that we've fixed this, everything is working. We've got our user, we've got our email, we got our name. Those 3 variables are the start to this process. And the next step is to figure out what roles do I have. So let's go ahead and hit enter a couple times here. I usually recommend adding a comment, so let's do that before I start. And to add a comment, you have a couple different options. You can just put 2 slashes like this, and then say maybe set user information. Very simple, very straight to the point, and it explains what these things are. You could also just put it like here and say set user record information. And then you could explain what each one of these does. The main thing is you want to put some documentation in your app to explain what are you doing? Like, what does this stuff do? That way, if you leave the organization or you have to hand the app over to somebody else, they can very quickly read the documentation you provided in the app that explains what you're doing. You want to make sure you add these information snippets as you go in this build process, because you might come back into this app in 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, and say, okay, what was I trying to do? Why did I do this? And if you've got a record that explains kind of your thought process, or maybe you're running into an issue that explains this, it'll be a lot easier to future you to troubleshoot any issues in the future if you've got some documentation from the past. So just kind of throwing that out there to help out those developers and future developers that might be looking at your application. All right, so let's go ahead and do the next step. And now what we want to do is see what role should I have? So what we want to do is a lookup, but we also want to set a variable based off of it. So let's go ahead and set. And in this case, I just say, is user admin? Am I an admin? Very simple question. I usually frame a lot of these in the context of a question. And case does matter. So if you like lowercase or uppercase, that does matter when you set these up. So make sure you kind of think through what is easier for you to remember. Some people do a lowercase I. I typically like uppercase letters for my words. So is user admin, I usually capitalize all 3. It really doesn't matter. Whatever your preference is, just try to be consistent, because it will make multiple apps much easier to manage if you're consistent across all of your different apps. And then let's go ahead and hit the comma button here. Now we want to do a lookup. So let's go ahead and hit lookup. And in this case, we're going to look at our table, right? So what do we call our table? We'll just type in access, and then it'll kind of find our project request access management. And then we want to put a comma. And in this case, what we're looking for is actually the person field. So let's go ahead and type person. And we're looking for a specific item of person. Again, person is kind of like a lookup, so you have access to all of the related information. So if I hit the dot, I'm going to get all of that related information. And in this case, I'm going to go with email, because again, email is unique typically inside of an organization. So you're not going to see anybody else that has that exact same email. That's why they add 1s and 12s and 15s to people that have the same name, like John Smith, for example. You might have 12 of those or 15 of those inside of your organization. They add those because the email is a unique item. And it has to be, because how else would they deliver the email if you had the exact same email address? So it has to be unique. It's a unique identifier for the person. So it makes it great for confirming whether somebody is who they're supposed to be or that they have access to a tool like this, for example. So we want to say in the project request access management person.email field, does it equal the GBL user email? That's the first question. Does it equal this person? And when we frame that as also, we're saying and. So we want to say and admin. And because it's a Boolean, we want to say, is it true? Now, if you use a choice column, you would just put it like this as yes, but we used a Boolean for this particular example. So we'll go with true, and we want to close off our lookup, and we want to close off our set. And now essentially we are ready to go. We can see that we've got the format text option up there. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of times I keep it formatted like this when we're doing lookup columns. For me, this is a little bit easier to read than if we were to hit the format text column here and we see it this way. That is a lot harder for me to read for some reason. I like it actually the way that it is right here when I'm working with this. For whatever reason, this makes much more sense to me to read. But yes, if you hit the format text, it will put it in the proper formatting. But one other thing we want to take a look at is we want to add a not blank on here as well. So let's go ahead and not is blank. And then we'll go ahead and close this. Because again, we want to account for potential errors that might happen here. So we want to account for not blank basically. So let's go ahead and put that in there. And we can see we've got our format text, and that's always my indicator that, yep, we're pretty much on par. We got everything set up the way that it needs to be. We've got everything in there. Now, how do we test this? We go here and let's test it. Is user admin? And it says false. And you're like, well, why is it false? Well, for the first thing, we didn't actually create any records when we created our SharePoint list, so we probably need to add ourselves in there to kind of start off with. So let's go back to SharePoint quick and we'll add ourselves in. Now let's go ahead and add a new item. And our title, we're just going to ignore that. We're going to say admin, and then we're going to find my name, and we're just going to hit save. All right, so we've been added in here. Again, we're going to cover this in a future video on how to handle the title column or potentially other metadata related with the particular logged in user. Let's go ahead and head back to our app now and see if we've got updated information. All right, so the other thing we have to do is run our OnStart. Again, all of this is inside of our OnStart. So we have to actually run this, and we probably actually need to look at our data source. So let's refresh our data settings here quick. All right, there we go. So we've got that refreshed and we're true. So it recognizes that our data source says I'm in there as an admin. So we are now an admin as far as this app is concerned on every single screen, every single object. We can use admin indefinitely on pretty much everything that we need to from this point on. Now, this is just as easy if you were to create a view only, or you create some other contributor, editor, developer. The sky's the limit. And I highly recommend you do a developer, just my take on things, because there are some things you're going to want to test that you may not want the admins, who are typically the people that you're building this for, are a lot of times your admins. You may not want them to see some of the things that you're working on. So you create a developer view so you can hide the stuff from the admins that you're currently working on. Otherwise they get confused, hey, this doesn't work or this doesn't work. Well, yeah, it's not done yet, so it's not working. So I always recommend adding a developer option in there so you can see the things that you're working on, but admins and people that are testing your application, they can't see those things. So just kind of food for thought on things you might want to consider adding as far as roles. I can use whether I'm an admin or not to determine whether something's visible or not. So what does that look like, right? So let's just demonstrate what this looks like quick. So let's go ahead and add a text label, and we'll just say test. Very simple, not super complicated. And we're going to set the visibility basically for this. And we say is user admin. And if it's true, it's visible. Let's go back to our SharePoint quick. Let's go ahead and adjust this. So we're going to say, I'm not an admin anymore. Let's take away our admin rights. We're no longer an admin. We don't right to modify anything anymore. So we're no longer an admin. Let's go back to our application quick and see what happens. You always have to do a refresh on any on app starts. So let's go ahead and refresh first our data source, and then we'll go ahead and go back to here and refresh this. So we'll run on start, and all of a sudden it's gone, right? So this is how you can hide things that admins can't see, contributors, maybe they can see it, but maybe the view onlys, they can't see it. This is how you hide a lot of things inside your app so that only certain roles can see what's going on. So mission accomplished. We have accomplished what we've set out to do. We've essentially created permission structures so that we can hide different things and only certain roles can go in there. And you can put as many of these as you want in there. The sky's the limit. Create as many as you want. My recommendation is kind of keep it small. It's a little bit easier to manage, but I've had some as many as 10 to 15 different roles. I've had some that are just admin, and I always add the developer obviously in there. I'm actually going to show you how to do this all within the application in future videos. So you don't have to do this using the SharePoint list. Again, my goal when I create an application is the user should never have to leave the application to maintain the application. That's always the goal. It's not always possible, but for the most part, that is the goal, is we should not have to access the SharePoint list for anything. But now I mentioned in the beginning of this video, there are two primary options. This is actually the way I don't necessarily recommend you go, but this is the most common approach for doing access inside of an application. So we've created this. This is good. This works. What other options are there? First of all, I would normally complete this. So I would say something like access control might be a good way to put this in there. So now that we've got this kind of labeled out what these things do, let's go ahead and get rid of it. And when I say get rid of it, I don't actually mean get rid of it. Let's go ahead and move it to the bottom, and we're going to actually get rid of all of this. And all we have to do is put a slash and our star in there, and then we'll do the same thing on the bottom here. And now this is all coded out. So none of this will be a factor moving forward, but we'll keep it in there. We'll put it at the bottom. So that's option one, and we'll actually go ahead and put that in there. So we'll say option one. So this is one option. What is another option to do? So now there's a great feature that came out about 4 or 5 years ago. It's the with statement. So now what we can do is we can create a with statement, which is awesome. It's a great way to do things. And I usually go ahead and put this in there just like this, just to kind of complete some of this stuff out of there. And it is pretty much that. And then we add a comma. And then in the middle here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable. And for this variable, we'll say, I don't know, user. Very simple, very to the point. We're basically taking care of the first part of what we did with user information. And we'll call it user, and then we'll put a colon here, and then we're going to say user information. So essentially the record for the entire user that's logged in here. We'll go over here, and then we're going to hit enter. And in this case, we'll go ahead and format it the way it's supposed to. So you're supposed to tab in, and then we'll say set. And what we're going to do is we're going to say GBL user. Again, that is our first one here. So we'll say GBL user, and we'll go user. And that's it. Very simple. And we'll close that off. And then, oh, that wasn't supposed to be uppercase. So just like this. And we'll Control Z that to get rid of that because that's actually an error. And then we'll do a semicolon, and then we'll hit enter again. And then we're going to do the next one. And the next one is our email, right? So we'll go GBL user, email, and then we're going to close this off. And we're going to say Coalesce, and we're going to say user.email. And again, it does that uppercase thing that we don't like doing. And then we're going to go ahead and put a comma, and we're going to close this off and put another semicolon. So what we're doing is we're saying the first entry, right? So essentially we're saying pick the first thing, and if it's not there, then it's blank. So we don't have an email address. That's essentially what we're doing with the Coalesce option here, and we're creating these variables. But what we're doing, why do you do this versus here? You might be, hey, what's the purpose of doing this, right? Well, every time that we do this, we're doing a lookup essentially. We're putting a strain on the tool. And it's not much, it's a very small amount of memory or space or time that it takes to process these things. But when we take this approach, we're saying the user is this. We set the record and it's set. From that point on, everything's internal to the app. We're no longer doing calls for lookups or pulling information from anywhere. Maybe you're doing an Office 365 lookup. You're no longer pulling that every single time you're doing this. It's one and done, and you're ready to go. So we're doing that for each one of these variables. First, we set the user record, then we set the email record. Now let's go ahead and set the username. So we'll go ahead and set, and we'll say username, comma, and again, we'll do the Coalesce here, and we'll say user. And in retrospect, maybe I should have uppercased this. This is kind of annoying that it you know increases the first character. I mean, I like that when I'm typing a Word document, not so much when I'm working on code, but it is kind of what it is at this point. And then we'll say full name. And then again, we'll, oops, hit some wrong keys there. And then we'll close this off. Now that closes off what we're currently working off. Now we still want to do one more to close off the entire function. Oh, looks like we have an extra one for some reason here, so that's why we're not closing this off. There we go. So now we're closed off. Now we want to have our semicolon because we still want to do our lookup, right? So we want to move on to the next one. And again, I put the space in there because I always plan on putting a little bit of a comment to explain kind of what we're doing. So we've done this part. Now, what we want to do is kind of get ready for the next part. And the next part is instead of doing this lookup where you might do this 10, 15, 20 times, this actually is the more efficient approach. And what we're going to do is we're going to say set, and we're going to say GBL roll, and then we're going to go ahead and look for the first in this particular case because we want to make sure we get only the first record. Now, in reality, because of the way that we set this up, probably not necessary because you shouldn't have any duplicate records. But again, better safe than sorry. So we're going to go ahead and put a first in there because we want the first record option. And then we're going to go ahead and put a filter. And it automatically detected we only have one data source, so this kind of makes it a little bit easier. And then we're going to put a comma because we want to find our person field. And specifically from the person field, we want to find the email address. So let's go ahead and select that. And it's going to be equal to our GBL user email. And then we go ahead and close this off, each part. And we now have essentially a record of our entry inside of the tool. Now essentially pulled two records. We pulled it here when we did this user call, and we pulled it here. Now the goal is to reduce the number of times we're pulling data from outside of the application. So what's the next step? So let's go ahead and come down here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use this information. So we're going to set is user admin, just like we did before. But this time we're going to do things a little bit different, and we're going to use that Coalesce feature again. So let's go ahead and put that in there, and we're going to say GBL role dot. Again, this is the whole record, so we have access to everything that's in there, and we created a column called admin. So let's go ahead and put that in there. And then what we want to do is hit equal to true, and if it's true, and how Coalesce works is it basically evaluates things in order. So the first thing that is true, it stops. And we're essentially saying we want true, but if it's not true, what do we want? We want false. So let's go ahead and put that in there, and then we'll close it off, and then we'll put our semicolon. And again, I always put the semicolon just as a rule of thumb or as a habit because I know, especially in an OnStart, that I'm going to be adding more stuff that follows because this is just the admin. What about the view only? What about the contributor? What about all the other roles that potentially I'll have to build into this tool? So essentially what we've got now is we've set up our user, which is kind of the big scheme. Really, we don't necessarily need this. And a lot of times when I start working at accessibility issues and getting rid of some clutter, it always says, hey, you didn't use the user. I'd much rather have it and not need it than not have it. So I always, as a general rule, build it. Typically, the only things I actually use from this process are these two fields here. So if you do want to get rid of this, that's fine. You can get rid of this and not have a problem. Could potentially get rid of it if you wanted to. But now we've got that, and then we essentially create a record from our access management table that we created and said, hey, this is the logged in users role. It has everything, everything that was in there, whether it's admin, view only, developer, whatever it is, it's going to have it in there. And then you can set for each one of those using this record what role they have. All right, so that's essentially what we've done at this point. All right, let's go ahead and put this back up here. Every time you change your app OnStart, you always have to refresh. So let's go ahead and refresh, run OnStart. And as we can see, true. And the test is now showing again. So essentially, everything is working the way that we expected. So what does this accomplish over this approach? This runs one time. We pull the information one time from this user function, and we can get all this information. We run this one time, and then all of our potential setting of roles run based off of this. So it essentially, we have to go outside the app less often. So you might have 10 or 15 different lookups. Each one of those lookups slow the process down. So it's a far more efficient process. Again, two different ways, both work. This one's just a little bit more efficient on your app resources. So it's a great approach for accomplishing this type of a task inside of the tool. Now that's pretty much it for today's video. In future videos, we're going to take a look at how you can actually change the SharePoint lists and adjust permissions from within the app. And you can basically complete all of this from inside of the app versus having to go to the SharePoint list. So check back if you're interested in seeing how you could use toggles or yes, nos to essentially manage permissions from within the app and avoid your users and admins and everybody else having to go to the actual SharePoint list to modify permissions. Hope you found this content helpful. Until next time.